and those watching. So inshallah, we'll commence with the questions that we have with us. And as we proceed, bi'idhnillah, we will then add the questions that you give in the chat below. And if your questions, if we can manage to reach your questions during the time of this live stream, we would engage with them. And if not, then we would add them to our list and bi'idhnillah, have those questions prepared for you in the next session, bi'idhnillah ta'ala, or the upcoming sessions, inshallah ta'ala. So with that, we commence. The first question that I have, and it's very important for me to also explain that we are looking at the questions from the perspective of the Shafi'i school of thought, and we would welcome any questions from any school of thought. However, I would only answer or endeavor to answer the questions from the Shafi'i school of thought, bi'idhnillah ta'ala. And if you do have questions for any other schools of thought, we have teachers who would be addressing those in upcoming sessions, inshallah. So we now commence with the first question. What are the methods of combining and shortening the prayers for the traveler? What are the methods for combining and shortening the prayers for the traveler? So, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. According to the Shafi'i school, the traveler is afforded the dispensation of jam', which is to combine prayers, qasr, which is to shorten prayers, or both. So they could also do both combining as well as shortening the prayers if they so desire. The two travel dispensations, the shortening and the joining of prayers, they are not intrinsically connected, so they do not affect one another. One may take both together, either one of the two, or neither of them. So one could still perform prayers as per usual during travel. In the Shafi'i school of thought, it is actually superior to not take dispensations that are permissible. In other words, if there's a dispensation, one is afforded this dispensation as a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but you are not compelled to take the dispensation. That would be the rukhsa. The azima, which is not the dispensation, it's the normal law or the strict law, if you'd like, that would be considered the azima, and that would be the more preferred option in the Shafi'i school, generally speaking. And this I'm referencing from the Minhaj al-Talibin of Imam al-Nawawi, specifically with regards to the answer. And then, of course, the principle of azima and rukhsa can be located from any Shafi'i usul text or legal theory text, such as Lub al-Usul by Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari and its Sharh Ghayat al-Wusul. So those are the two dispensations in relation to combining and shortening prayers for the traveler. However, the second question that we have actually ties into this, so I paired them together. So the second question is, what are the basic rulings of prayer during a travel? Because there's one aspect to look at, and that is, what are the dispensations? So we've covered that, qasr, jam, or both, or neither of them. But then, what are the rules pertaining to, how to pray these salahs during a travel? So, inshallah, let's proceed to answer that. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. It is permissible to join between the dhuhr and the asr prayer during travel. So, to make jama' or to combine between the dhuhr and the asr prayer, as well as the maghrib and the Isha prayer. So, the dhuhr and the asr prayer can be paid together, and the maghrib and the Isha prayer can be paid together. This means that you cannot pay, for example, Isha with Fajr or Fajr with Dhuhr, mathalan, or so you cannot do those combinations. It's only the combinations that I've alluded to earlier on. And then, of course, you may pray the combinations in the time of either of the two pairs. So, for example, Dhuhr and Asr can be prayed together in the time of Dhuhr, or in the time of Jumu'ah if it is a Friday, or it can be paid together in the time of Asr. So, in other words, postponing the earlier prayer to the later time with certain conditions. And similarly, the Maghrib prayer can be paid with the Isha prayer during the time of Maghrib, or they both can be postponed to the time of Isha, depending on which is more convenient. And there are some guidelines in our fiqh in relation to this. So, that's in terms of the combinations. But there are certain conditions of this. So it is permissible to join the noon prayer and the mid-afternoon or Asr prayer during the time of either of them, or the Friday Jumu'ah prayer and the mid-afternoon or Asr prayer in the time of the Friday prayer. And permissible to similarly join the sunset prayer or Maghrib and the nightfall prayer Isha during the time of either, provided that one joins them during a journey in which prayer may be shortened. So the conditions of what type of journey may you take this dispensation in are important, so that we can know, okay, I'm on a journey. Does my journey validate, taking these dispensations, or does it not? But if one is traveling, okay, that's the first point. If one stops traveling, if you stop traveling to rest, for example, during the time of the first of the two prayers, then it would actually be better to pray in the time of the first of the two prayers. But if one is traveling steadily during the first of the two prayers, then it would be better to pray it in the latter prayers time. So if you take an example, if you're praying and you're on the road and you're actively driving or flying, for example, through Maghrib, and you know that you would reach your destination by the time of Isha, then it would be better to delay your Maghrib prayer till the time of Isha with the conditions that need to be met. However, if you find that you are at a resting place or a stopover, or it's a time where it's convenient to pray during the Maghrib's waqt, then it would be recommended to rather bring the Isha time forward, or the Isha prayer forward to the Maghrib's waqt, so that you can pray both during that time. And of course, the reasoning here is that it is more comfortable, and therefore you know that you're going to fulfill the prayer as opposed to risking losing that opportunity later. It is permissible to shorten the currently prescribed prayer of Dhuhr or Asr and Isha to 2 rak'ats each when one fulfills the conditions of travel. So the Qasr, right? We spoke about the Jam', how to combine the prayers, but now we look at the Qasr. So Qasr means to shorten prayers. There are 5 compulsory prayers in the day. 2 of them are already considered short prayers. So the Fajr prayer is 2 rak'ats for Fajr, and the Maghrib prayer is 3 rak'ats. These prayers, Fajr and Maghrib, cannot be shortened further. So you don't shorten Fajr to make it 1 rak'ah, and you don't shorten Maghrib to make it, 2 or 1.5 rak'at, mathalan. You simply shorten the longer prayers. So one may shorten the Dhuhr prayer, the Asr prayer, and the Isha prayer if the conditions of traveling are met. So that is about the 3rd time that I've alluded to the conditions of a valid travel in which one may legitimately take the dispensations of prayer, or for a traveler to pray. So what are those conditions? Firstly, the travel must be for a reason that is not disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It must be for a reason that is not disobedience for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as there is no dispensation to shorten prayers on such a trip. But it's very important to understand this condition does not mean that, the travel needs to be sin-free, because humans, we are prone to sin. Kullu bani Adama khatta'un wa khayru khatta'ina tawwabun. All of the children of Nabi Adam alayhi salatu wasalam, they make mistakes. And the best of those who make mistakes are those who repent to Allah, Rabbul Izzati wal Jalal. So it's not about making sure that your journey is sin-free. We should always try, not just on a travel, but in our every moment of existence, right? Ittaqillah haythuma kunt. Have taqwa of Allah wherever you may be. However, chances are that we will slip up, right? Slip of the tongue, slip of the gaze, etc. So it's not that the travel needs to be sin-free. The point here, this particular shart or condition, is that the purpose of the journey, right, the very objective of the journey should not be that the journey is done for a purpose of disobedience. In other words, somebody who's going on a trip to, say, a renowned place for gambling, and their purpose for going there is to go and gamble, then the objective of that journey makes it invalid for that person to take the dispensation for shortening the prayer or for joining the prayer, because the dispensations will not be afforded for reasons of disobedience. So it's really the core purpose of one's journey must not be for disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then the second condition is that the journey needs to be, and this is an approximation, 80 kilometers at least, and that's one way. So not 40 kilometers to and 40 kilometers from. And in terms of miles, because I know that we have an international audience, so in terms of miles, it's approximately 50 miles, right? And again, this is one way. So if you are on a journey and it's more than this 80 kilometer or 50 mile a distance, one way, then it validates as far as the distance is concerned. So it must be for a reason other than disobedience. It must be for a permissible reason. Now, let's go back to the first shart again. The permissible reason, rest and rejuvenation, is a legitimate reason as well. It's a permissible reason. It's not purely for recreation. It's not purely for fun. You're actually going with the purpose of rest and rejuvenation. So that is another reason that could be legitimate. Some people think that if it's purely for recreation, purely for rest and rejuvenation, then it's not valid to pray. Or if the journey is convenient, then it's not valid to pray. No. Condition number one is simply stating it mustn't be for a disobedient reason. Condition number two is that the distance must be at least 80 kilometers one way or 50 miles one way. One may also shorten the above prayers, as we mentioned, when one both misses them and makes them up on the trip, though one must pray the full number if one misses them while not traveling and makes them up on the trip. So that's a bit of a separate issue, but the point is, if you miss a prayer, and we shouldn't ever miss our prayers, but if you miss the prayer on the trip and you also make them up on the trip, you still are afforded to make them up in the way of the dispensations. In other words, to shorten them, and Allah knows best. However, if you miss them on the trip and you make them up when you are once again resident back home, now you no longer have that dispensation at your disposal. So let's say somebody missed a dhuhr prayer on a journey, and then they arrived back home and they now want to make qada, they want to make up for that missed dhuhr prayer. They cannot now make 2 raka'at for that dhuhr prayer. They now need to perform that prayer as per normal, and Allah knows best. As far as the distance is concerned, it is valid for a travel by water or by land or any other means. So if technology advances to such a state whereby you can traverse that distance within an instant, and this is actually mentioned in the text of Umdatus Salik, and then the Sharh Faydu Ilahil Malik mentions whether this is preternaturally, right, whether this is done by some miracle, a karama for example, one may still shorten the prayer. The brevity of time taken to travel the distance is of no consequence. The brevity of time taken to travel the distance is of no consequence. So again, if somebody were to take a car and drive for 80 kilometers one way or 50 miles, that would take significantly longer than the person who takes a jet plane or a helicopter, mathalan. But that wouldn't have any consequence on the dispensation. You may still pray the dispensation. Another thing that has no consequence of the dispensation is the convenience of the journey. And this is a common misconception in relation to prayers on travel. There's a notion that if the traveling is convenient, if it's convenient and I have all the luxuries at my disposal and I'm sitting in first class, etc., then how can I take the dispensation? Firstly, not taking the dispensation is always an option in the Shafi'i school, and it is considered the better option if there's no harm entailed. So that puts that aside. You have that option. However, one should not get into a position where one starts thinking that, that's the only way and nobody should take the dispensation. No, the dispensation is completely valid regardless of convenience. And the argument that, in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, traveling was much more difficult and arduous than it is today, that argument doesn't quite stand, because fiqh is not based on things that are subjective. And this is generally speaking. So the ratio legis, or the illah, the legal reasoning behind a ruling, would never be based on something that is completely subjective. And convenience and comfort is subjective. So a journey may be completely comfortable and convenient for person A, while for person B it may be extremely arduous and difficult. Distance, however, is something that is objective and consistent for both parties. And the same thing applies with the time taken to travel. We don't consider how long does it take to travel for 80 kilometers or 50 miles. We consider the distance because, again, depending on the means of transportation, walking 80 kilometers, mathalan, or 50 miles is going to take far longer than driving or flying for 80 kilometers or 50 miles. Again, that would be subjective. So the law is not based on subjective factors, but rather on measurable, objective factors, and Allah knows best. Then another question comes about when there are two routes to a destination and one of them is less than the distance that permits shortening prayers, but one chooses the longer route for a legitimate purpose, for example, safety, convenience, or recreation, sightseeing, etc., then even though the shorter distance would not have allowed one to travel, then you still have that option because you went the longer distance. And you went the longer distance because of a legitimate reason. And I'll give a practical example for this. Of course, the recreation is provided that recreation is merely the reason for taking that route, not the reason for the trip itself, which must have some other legitimate purpose, such as trade, for an outing, a simple outing, sightseeing, mathalan, is not a legitimate purpose. Then one may shorten prayers. But if the reason for choosing the longer way is to take the dispensation, then doing so is not valid and one must pray the full number. Okay, so the practical example. There's a town in South Africa called Worcester. And Worcester is, I think, about 90 kilometers away, depending on which part of my city you travel from. However, let's say you travel from here, and from here to Worcester, where I am now, to this particular town, is 70 kilometers, right? So you're 10 kilometers short for the dispensation of traveling. However, there is a tunnel, and the tunnel goes through a mountain, and the tunnel makes it such that you can actually, get there within 70 kilometers. If you go around the mountain, then you're going to reach maybe 90 kilometers. So by going around the mountain, you would have the ability to take the travel dispensation. But by going through the tunnel, you would not. So if you have a legitimate reason to go around the mountain as opposed to going through the tunnel, such as you want to see, the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or there's someone who you would like to visit there, or you would like to show your family, the beauty of creation, any legitimate reason or permissible reason like that, then you may do so and you may take the dispensation. But if you go around the mountain simply because you want the dispensation, so you take the longer route, then that would not be valid. One would have to pray the full number of rak'at. And then finally, the destination must be known. It must be known. And someone whose journey constitutes of an act of disobedience, for example, somebody who is supposed to be working, but then they are dodging work, in some way or the other by going on this trip, that would be a means of deception, right? So that would be disobedience. Just as a small example, that would not be valid for taking the dispensations. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. Then, of course, there are other rules. There are other rules pertaining to when bringing the prayer forward, right? If you are praying Dhuhr and Asr and you're shortening both and you're joining them, then the way one would do that, if you bring it forward to Dhuhr's waqt, is to pray 2 rak'at of Dhuhr and immediately rise, read the Iqamah and start with the Asr prayer. And there shouldn't be any break between the two. There shouldn't be any significant break between the two. One wouldn't pray the Sunnah Salahs in between the two Salahs, in between the two Fard, but rather the Sunnah Salahs before, are prayed before, the sunnah salahs after dhuhr and before asr are delayed till after asr, right? So that's how you manage to not have a gap in between. And if you postpone the two prayers to the later prayers time, so mathalan Maghrib and Isha, you postpone it to the time of Isha, then it's a necessary condition that during the time of the earlier salah, so during the time of Maghrib, you must have had the intention to pray that salah in the later salah's time, and Allah knows best. So that's a summary of the answers, and we could perhaps add more, but for the sake of brevity, those are the basic rulings of prayer during the travel. Now, there's a third related question that we've also received for this particular session. When I say related question, I mean a question that relates to the discussion that we've had. So I've combined some of the questions together because they all are interrelated. The third question is, how many days can I perform my salah or my prayers as a traveler? How many days may I perform prayers as a traveler? So this relates to the extended number of days, because there's some ikhtilaf among the scholars as to how many days you have this validity. In order to understand this, one must understand when the journey begins and when the journey ends, right? What do I mean by that? Let's say today I'm going to be flying to, say, Canada. And I'm flying today at 3 p.m. Okay, it's a bad example because it's 3:25 now in South Africa. Let's say my flight is going to be at 5 p.m. Am I now a traveler because I'm traveling today? Am I a traveler the moment I get into my car? What if I stop at the Masjid on the way to the airport and pray Maghrib there? Can I then bring Isha forward because I'm on my way to Canada? When does the journey begin? And then furthermore, let's say I'm stopping over in Johannesburg, then I'm stopping over in Dubai, then I'm stopping over, at various places. Am I still a traveler when I'm at my stopover? Then let's say I arrive in Canada, but I'm only going to remain there for 2 days or 3 days or any number of days for that matter. Then am I still a traveler because I'm staying there a short period of time, etc.? A related question is, let's say I'm going on Umrah. So I'm a traveler while I'm proceeding towards the Holy Lands. When I arrive there, do I get to pray as a traveler for a certain number of days and thereafter I have to pray, my prayers as per normal? Or is there a limit? So this is why it's important to understand when the journey begins and when the journey ends in relation to when I may pray as a traveler on a journey. So the first thing we need to understand is the beginning of the journey. If one's city has walls or a clearly marked boundary, Now, this may sound somewhat foreign to many people, especially in more westernized societies, because generally speaking, cities don't, in modern day, have walls and clearly marked boundaries. Illa mashallah, there are some exceptions to that rule. But in 7th century Arabia, mathalan, and I think in most parts of the world at that time, a town or a city would have had some form of boundary wall, and everyone would know that that's the beginning of the city, that's the end of the city, simply for the sake of geographical location and identification. These days, however, cities have expanded. For example, Madinatul Munawwara today is far bigger than Madinatul Munawwara was in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Another example, Cape Town, South Africa, where I'm from, the geographical location or boundary is far more expansive today than it was even 50 years ago, 100 years ago. And these things are, sort of fluid because as the geographical situation changes, there's development and so on. So if there are walls and boundaries, one may begin shortening the prayers as soon as one has passed them. This is whether or not there are other buildings outside of them, it makes no difference. If there are no walls, there are no clearly marked boundaries, One may shorten one's prayers after passing beyond the last buildings. This excludes the farms and rural areas, orchards and cemeteries, etc. But basically the last buildings considered as part of that city. Now for non-scholars, this description is going to be very vague, right? And the best way of determining where the boundary of one's own location is to consult with scholars, and specifically consult with your local scholars, because they would have dealt with this question before. They would have looked at the geographical situation where you're from, and they'd be able to say, look, if you reach that point, then you're outside of the city. And once you reach that point, then you are considered a traveler. Because now, do you consider a suburb as a town or a city, which is closely related to what a town used to be? Do you consider the city itself, which is going to be very big? If I'm on my way to catch my flight to Canada and I stop at the Masjid on the way there, am I outside of the city already? Our local scholars here have looked at the geographical situation of Cape Town, South Africa, and said, look, if you reach the airport, then in terms of Cape Town city, you've now reached the boundary of the city. So at the airport already, you can pray as a traveler. That's when the journey begins. So in conclusion, the beginning of the journey is when you reach the boundary of your city or town. And to actually identify the boundary of your city or town, one needs to consult with local scholars who have looked at this and have analyzed the geographical situation where you're from and are able to determine where exactly that is, and Allah knows best. As for the end of the journey, when does the journey come to an end, and when may you no longer pray like a traveler would pray? When the trip ends, one must pray the full number of raka'at from that moment onwards. And a trip ends when one reaches one's hometown or the place where one would be resident from a Shari'i perspective. So of course, if I come back from Canada and I reach my hometown, I reach Cape Town, then the journey comes to an end, right? But what if I don't reach Cape Town? Let's say I'm coming back, but then I'm going to Egypt for a couple of days. When I say a couple of days, let's say 3 weeks, right? I go to Egypt for 3 weeks. The moment I arrive in Egypt, I'm considered resident, because I'm not going to just pass through or be there for a short period of time. I'm actually settling down. And the Sharia does not take into consideration where you have your house and where your family is and where they are established. It takes into consideration how long will you be settled in a particular location. So your hometown, that's clear, because you live there and you're going to be there and you're going to be living from there. But in addition to that, by the mere intention to stay in a place for at least 4 days. Less than 4? No. But once you reach 4 days, then you are going to be considered a non-traveler, a resident in that place. Okay. So I said I come back from Canada and I'm going to stop over in Egypt. If when I arrive in Egypt, I know that I'll be staying here for 4 days, then from the moment I arrive, I'm no longer a traveler, I'm considered a resident there. But what does that mean? That means 4 days, other than the day of arrival and other than the day of departure, you don't count that in, right? If I'm going to stay there for less than 4 days, then again, other than the day of arrival, other than the day of departure, then I'm not considered a resident there and I can pray as a traveler throughout my stay there. If it's for more than 4 days, then obviously I would be a non-traveler. I would be a resident there from the moment that I arrive. Another practical example. Somebody goes for Umrah. So they leave Europe and they arrive in Makkah al-Mukarramah on the Monday. They are planning to depart from Makkah al-Mukarramah on the Friday. So you don't count in the Monday and you don't count in the Friday. How many days in between Monday and Friday? 3. So you have Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. 3 days. So that means the entire time that they are in Makkah al-Mukarramah, if they so wish, I don't think anybody would, but if they so wish, they may take the dispensation to pray as a traveler. On the other hand, if you go and perform Umrah and you're going to remain in Mecca for, let's say, 8 days. So you don't count the day of arrival. Let's say you arrive on a Monday, and you don't count the day of departure, but in between you still have, say, 6 days, right? Because it's more than 4 days. So the moment you arrive in Mecca, you are already a resident. It's not that you can pray Jam' and Qasr for 3 or 4 days and then you have to pray as per normal. No. The moment you arrive, you have the intention for staying for longer than 4 days, rather longer than 3 days and 4 days and up. Therefore, by the mere intention to stay in that place for 4 days or more than 3 days, we can also express it as that. It's kind of easier to say more than 3 days. That would mean that you are not a traveler. You are a resident the moment that you arrive there. And you cannot pray the dispensation. Praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. So that's in terms of the number of days, okay? There's a difference, of course, in the madhahib of Imam Shafi'i and Imam Abu Hanifa in relation to this. So if you follow the Hanafi school, the rulings are different and you would need to consult the experts in that regard. And we have, mashallah, amazing scholars here on this platform who follow the Hanafi school and who have studied therein. So do refer to their Q&A sessions, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And then the other way in which your journey can come to an end is by staying that long without the intention, right? By staying that long without the intention, so that after one has stayed 4 full days, not counting the day of arrival and departure, one prays the full number of raka'at, unless one is staying in a place in order to fulfill a purpose that one expects to be accomplished and intends to leave as soon as one does. As long as this is the case, one may shorten one's prayers for up to 18 days. So what is this referring to? Let's say you have to go to a particular city and the reason for going there is some administrative purpose. So you need to fix a passport, you need to fix some paperwork, etc. Every other condition of travel and shortening one's prayers and combining one's prayers on travel has been met. But you're not sure how long you're going to stay there. So am I going to be here for 3 days? Am I going to be here for 4 days, 5 days, 6 days, 7 days? I don't know. Because you don't know how long you're going to be there, you're sort of in a nomad position. And therefore, for as long as you are in this position of uncertainty, you may pray as a traveler up to 18 days, right? Up to 18 days until the situation changes and either you reach 18 days and then you can no longer pray as a traveler, or the situation changes and they tell you, look, it's going to take 2 days from now or 3 days from now and you've been praying for 7 days already, then you know, okay, I cannot, because I know that I'm going to only be here for a certain number of days, or I know that I'm going to be here for an extended number of days. Once you have clarification, and then the situation would change. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. طيب, so that was in relation to traveling. And there are possibly other questions that may come up, such as the questions that we've covered already. But now we proceed to move on bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. The next question is related to tahara, right? Tahara, purification. And the question is, what are the nullifiers of wudu? What are the nullifiers of ablution? So in the Shafi'i school of thought, there are only 4 actions, or only 4 things that would nullify one's wudu. Only 4 things. What are they? Number 1, it is the contact, the direct skin contact between a male and his unmarriageable kin. A male and his marriageable kin, not his unmarriageable kin, right? The direct skin contact between a male and his marriageable kin. So this is anyone that he can get married to, right, under some circumstance, or even is married to, so his own wife, right? So the contact of skin. And I'm saying this in no particular order. Then it is khuruj min as-sabilain. Anything that exits from the 2 private parts, the front private part or the rear private part for a male or a female. This is whether it is something natural that usually comes from there, or something unnatural, like a stone or worm, or something that is inserted and then removed. So anything that comes from the 2 private parts would break the wudu. Number 3, touching human private parts, direct skin touching with the parts of one's hands that connect when we put our hands together. So the palms, the insides of the fingers, etc. Touching the human private parts with that part of one's hands. And this is any human private parts, whether it be a child, a baby, etc. So, the common example is changing the diapers of a child or making istinja for one's child. If there's direct skin contact of the parts of the hand that connect when we put our two hands together like this, that would nullify one's ablution. So that would be 3. And then the last one, again, not necessarily in that order, is the loss of consciousness or the loss of intellect through sleep or other when the buttocks is not firmly placed onto the ground. The loss of one's consciousness when the buttocks is not firmly placed onto the ground. So if somebody falls asleep even for a moment while lying down, or even while on their side, right, or any position, if one falls asleep for a moment and one's buttocks was not firmly placed on the ground, that is breaking of one's wudu automatically. However, if somebody falls asleep or they lose consciousness while their buttocks is placed firmly on the ground, so somebody is sitting on a chair, say in a car, in a plane, at work in their chair, which you shouldn't be falling asleep at work, or in the masjid when the imam is giving the khutbah, wal-iyadhu billah, you shouldn't be falling asleep then. So if your buttocks is placed firmly on the ground and you fall asleep or you lose consciousness, then the wudu is not broken, provided that the buttocks remains firmly placed on the ground. And it makes no difference whether they are reclining against something like a backrest or a wall, or whether they have some other form of support, or whether they are just sitting upright and they manage to fall. I don't know if that's possible, if you can fall asleep sitting upright. But as long as the buttocks is placed firmly on the ground, it would not break the wudu. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. طيب. Okay, so here are some questions in relation to what we've covered already. And I will read through them, and if they are directly related, then we will cover them. And I'll check whatever questions are new, we will, inshallah ta'ala, cover those in future durus, and I'll just get through the questions that we have here. The one is it a valid opinion to join the prayers without any reason whenever one wishes in the Shafi fiqh, even if it becomes a habit? No, that's not valid, right? There are situations in which joining prayers are valid, such as travel, such as rain and so on, and that requires more explanation. But it's not valid to just join prayers whenever one wishes in Shafi fiqh. No, that's absolutely not valid, and Allah knows best. The other questions I can see, they are related to new masail, other masail, so we'll add them to the list bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, and then we'll proceed. So what I was answering a moment ago is, what are the nullifiers of wudu? In other words, what are the things that would break wudu in the Shafi'i school of thought? So we said there are 4, and only those 4 and nothing else. So if there's any uncertainty, did this break my wudu, did that break my wudu, the answer is, does it form part of the 4? If it forms part of the 4, then yes, it broke my wudu. If it does not form part of the 4, it will not break my wudu. What are those 4 things? Al-khuruj min as-sabilain, something coming from the 2 private parts. Anything, any substance, any gas, anything that comes from the 2 private parts, that would break one's wudu. Number 2, direct contact, that's skin-to-skin contact of a male and a female who are marriageable, meaning they may get married in some circumstance or the other. Number 3, it is touching human private parts with the parts of one's hands that make contact when you put your 2 hands together like this. In other words, not the back part, not the nails, not in between the fingers, but the insides of one's palms basically and the fingers. And then number 4, losing consciousness or falling asleep when one's buttocks are not firmly placed on the ground, right? So even if you just for a moment fall over, or as you wake up, you just, one side of your buttocks is lifted from the ground and the other side remains firmly on there, that would still nullify the wudu, and Allah knows best. Now we move on to the next the next question, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, and that is it considered obligatory to pray in the masjid? Praying in the masjid is considered a highly emphasized sunnah. Praying in the masjid is considered a highly emphasized sunnah. And some scholars refer to it as a sunnah kifaya. So if some of the community prays in the masjid and they keep the salah alive in that sense, then everyone is sort of absconded from that, not obligation, but from that sunnah of fulfilling that. So praying in jama'ah is also highly emphasized, and the two are not necessarily linked, right? So the optimum way of praying is to pray in jama'ah in the masjid from the beginning of its waqt with the imam from the opening Allahu Akbar and in the front saf. That would be the optimum way of praying. If one can pray, then, if one can pray and sort of aim for the best, that would be ideal. If you cannot get everything, then don't leave everything. Ma la yudraku kulluhu la yutraku kullu. So if you cannot get all of that, then get as much of that as you can. So let's say you don't make it to the masjid at all, still try to pray in jama'ah, because jama'ah is rewarded, as the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ states, 25 times more or 27 times more than the salah prayed alone. And if one wants to pray in jama'ah and you don't have a group of other males, it is considered jama'ah in the Shafi madhab, as Imam Nawawi comments in Al-Majmu' Sharh al-Muhadhab, for a man to pray with his wife is also considered jama'ah. So that is considered jama'ah as well. That said, let us not become complacent and think, okay, because it's jama'ah to pray with my spouse at home, let me pray like that and I'll forego every other recommendation. No, the ideal is still to pray in jama'ah, in the masjid, in the first saf, and to be there from the beginning of the waqt, from the first takbir. That would be the optimum. As far as how to balance, some people connect with this question. They connect, I want to pray with my family and pray at home, and I also want to pray at the masjid. So how do I get this balance? It's quite easy. If you follow the example of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam, he taught us this balance. As far as the obligatory prayers, the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam would always pray the obligatory prayers at the masjid when he was resident, meaning when he was not traveling or not on jihad. As far as the other prayers are concerned, the sunnah prayers, so this means the sunnah before the fard salah, the rawatib, the 5 daily prayers, the sunnahs that are connected to them, he prayed those at home. And most other non-obligatory prayers, he would also pray at home, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that is how we can manage to maintain that balance. It can be difficult depending on your distance from the masjid and the schedule of how the prayer is prayed at the masjid. But say, for example, the masjid is within a 5-minute travel distance from your place of residence or from your place of work. Then once the waqt enters, one immediately prays the sunnah prayers of that particular waqt, and then immediately proceeds to the masjid so that you reach there in time for the fard prayer. As soon as the fard prayer is over and you engaged in your adhkar and your dua, etc., whatever you can manage of doing extra, then you proceed to come back home and you pray your sunnah salahs at home. And this is the best way to pray, because this was the example of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. طيب. Another question in relation to salah and the times of salah is, concerning the Isha prayer and what time does the Isha prayer end. طيب, and then also connected to that, is it disliked to pray it after midnight? First and foremost, the time of the Isha prayer. Every waqt, according to the Shafi school, every waqt ends at the entrance of the next waqt, except for Fajr. Every waqt ends at the entrance of the next waqt or the following waqt, except for Fajr. So the time of Dhuhr ends at the time of Asr's entrance. The time of Asr ends at the time of Maghrib's entrance. The time of Maghrib ends at the time of Isha's entrance. The time of Isha ends at the time of Fajr's entrance. And Fajr ends the moment the first rays of the sun rises from the horizon. So that's the official ending time of Isha. But remember, for each waqt, there is the best time to pray. That would be fi awwal al-waqt, right when the waqt enters. Then there's the preferred time to pray. In other words, it's still good, it's still really good to pray at that time, and that would be in the first portion of that waqt. Then you have the permissible time, right? The permissible time. And you even have a haram time. What's the haram time? The haram time is it's still that waqt. But if you delay your salah all the way till the end of the waqt, so that some of your salah is inside of the waqt and some of your salah is outside of the waqt, it is haram to do so, it is a sin to do so, but that salah would still be considered valid and on time. So there's even that. As far as the Isha prayer is concerned, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, لو لم أشق على أمتي لأمرتهم بالعشاء عند نصف الليل. Had I not feared it to be difficult upon my ummah, I would have commanded them to postpone Isha or to delay Isha till the middle of the night. So from this, some scholars have opined that delaying Isha till much later or till the middle of the night is preferred. The Shafi madhab has not looked at it like that, but rather they looked at the fact that the Prophet ﷺ said, had I not feared it upon my ummah, but his practice continued to be predominantly fi awwal al-waqt, at the beginning of the time. So it's still best to pray Isha at the beginning of the time. And it is considered that after half of the night passes, the preferred time of praying Isha is now over, and you're now entering into disliked territory. So after half of the night passes, that would be permissible and valid, but it would be best to pray before half of the night, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. طيب, let's see how far we got. We've covered, I think, 6 central questions, and then there were some corollary questions that came about as well. Here's an interesting one, especially since we are approaching the month of Ramadan very quickly. Walillahi alhamd, may Allah make us reach the month of Ramadan and bless us in these months preceding Ramadan and allow us to prepare for it. Is it permissible to use chapstick while fasting? Is it permissible to use chapstick while fasting? Chapstick is, I think it's a brand, but it's basically something that you put on your lips in order to moisturize the lips. Is it permissible to use that while fasting? So the answer is, it depends on what you're going to be doing after you put it on. So firstly, to do anything, in the Shafi madhab, the strict ruling is that to do anything that's sort of pleasing to the senses, but not necessary, it is considered disliked, right? So to be excessive with perfume and so on, there is a view in the Shafi madhab that says it is considered disliked. However, chapstick is not necessarily part of pleasing the senses. It may be for medicinal purposes. I know that some people, their lips get really dry and cracked. So if it's for medicinal purposes and it's for the purposes of just keeping the skin healthy, then that's completely permissible, provided that you don't have the habit of putting on that much that it becomes, it enters into your mouth and you can actually taste it and you start swallowing it, that would break the fast. If you were to lick your lips with chapstick on and swallow that saliva, that would break your fast because it's wusulul ayn ila al-jawf min manfadhin maftuhin, which is how fast is essentially broken in the Shafi madhab. It is the ayn, right, a substance reaching the internal cavity of the body from an open passage. Again, it would be permissible, but you need to be careful in terms of application. You need to be careful in terms of is it that type of chapstick that's just for moisturizing, or is it something that you use because it's like lip gloss, for example? I know that's probably not suited for the males. Allah knows best. But if it's something for beautification and for sensory pleasure, then there is a view that sensory pleasures is considered disliked, and therefore you should try to refrain from that. However, if it's not, if it's for medicinal purposes, it's permissible, but one still needs to be careful in terms of its application and how you go about using that. And then finally, we only have time for about one more, inshallah ta'ala. Possibly two. We'll see how far we get. Yeah, let's try to fit in a few more. I see we've got about 8 minutes remaining. Does bleeding break one's wudu? Does bleeding break one's wudu? I think I've answered this question already. If you think about it, earlier on we asked what breaks one's wudu, and we said there are 4 things. Among those 4 things, my question to you now is, to check if you've learned something, inshallah. Was bleeding one of them? No, bleeding was not one of them. However, if your bleeding is from one of the 2 private parts, for example, so from inside of the private part and it comes out, that would be something that breaks the wudu, obviously. But I know that's not a regular case. So the point is, once you learn the arkan and the shurut of any particular ibadah, that really clarifies for you the do's and the don'ts of that ibadah. Before you learn the arkan and the shurut, you will have an infinite number of questions, and it will continue. So you'll ask about, does this break my wudu? Does that break my wudu? Does this break my fast? Does that break my fast? A tip, sort of a pro tip that I'd like to share with you is, learn the basics, and the basics will resolve most of your queries that may seem more advanced. And inshallah ta'ala, it would be beneficial for all of us. May Allah grant us success in terms of our learning, and may we always be students of deen in that matter. We still have some time. Why does touching one's spouse invalidate wudu in the Shafi'i school of thought? Why does touching one's spouse invalidate wudu in the Shafi'i school of thought? So this is slightly more advanced question in the sense that now we're going into the adilla. The easiest way to explain this is, number one, the Shafi'i madhab has a number of adilla, a number of proofs that espouse this particular position. So I'll mention one of the proofs. One of the proofs is from a verse in the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, بَعْدَ أَنْ أَقُولَ أَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ. So the verse in context is in relation to those things that would break one's wudu. Then أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ, that part of the verse is translated, and validly so, as or engages in physical intimacy with their wives, with their spouses. However, in another qira'ah, remember the Quran has different methods of reading. In another qira'ah, it is read, أَوْ لَمَسْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ, or you touch women. And that particular reading there, which is a mutawatir reading of the Quran, so it's as much part of the Quran as any other verse of the Quran, is one of the pieces of evidence that the Shafi madhab uses to prove that touching one's spouse invalidates the wudu. Generally, the question is not about why does the Shafi madhab consider this to break the wudu? Generally, the question is, there's a hadith, and the hadith gives the clear impression that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam kissed Sayyida Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, and he proceeded and then he prayed salah. And when students of sacred knowledge, when they come across this hadith for the first time, it's the first question that they ask. So how can the Shafi madhab then say otherwise? And the answer is that there are different views regarding the narration in question. There are different views as far as its authenticity is concerned, right? Some scholars, like Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Tirmidhi, they regarded this hadith as not being authentic. And other scholars, again, serious major scholars, they've regarded the hadith as being authentic. So there's a dispute in terms of its authenticity. And then that sort of resolves why there's this dispute. It's a genuine dispute in terms of authenticity, even though the imagery of the hadith or the story of the hadith seems to be clear, the authenticity is the issue. There are other narrations that also allude to the fact that the Prophet ﷺ would make contact with his wife. Again, Sayyida Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, for example, he would be praying, and the space that they had been in, or the living space that they had, was so small that he would have to move Sayyida Aisha's legs out of the way in order to go and pray sajda. And that again gives the impression that there was contact. But there, even though the narration is authentic, the impression isn't clear enough. So there's no mention of skin-on-skin contact, and there's no necessity for there to have been skin-on-skin contact. And the same thing, there are other narrations where the Prophet ﷺ is in sajda, and Sayyida Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha is looking for him in the dark, and she feels, and her hand touches the bottom of his foot, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So there, again, authentic as far as the narration is concerned, but not clear enough because it doesn't mention skin-on-skin contact. It's quite possible that his foot was covered, had a sock, had a khuf, etc. And therefore, there is a valid difference of opinion. So as far as touching one's spouse is concerned, firstly, we need to understand that all of the madhahib, they actually say that touching one's spouse breaks the wudu, but to different degrees. So the Shafi madhab says any touching, skin on skin, with whether there's desire or no desire. But the Maliki and the Hanbali madhab, for example, they limit the touching to touching with desire. So touching with desire breaks the wudu, whereas touching with no desire or accidental touch, that does not break the wudu. And the Hanafi madhab has a very limited way where the touching breaks the wudu, and that is actually the touching of the private parts only. So in essence, all of the madhahib say that touching between spouses, skin on skin, would break the wudu, but the circumstances differ. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. And then the very last question that I would have to deal with now, because we are on the last minute of the session, is it permissible to kiss one's spouse while fasting? Is it permissible to kiss one's spouse while fasting? And again, interestingly, Sayyida Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, our mother, she indicated that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam kissed her. And in the very narration that she speaks about where he sallallahu alaihi wasallam kissed her while he was fasting, she indicates that he was far more capable, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, of controlling his desire than any of you. So based on this narration and other evidence, the Shafi'i school opines that it is permissible, but it is makruh. It is disliked to kiss one's spouse while in a fasting state. And if there is the risk or the temptation or the risk of temptation that the kissing or the interaction or the fondling or whatever type of caressing, that one would like to engage in with one's spouse while fasting, if there's the risk that it may lead to physical intimacy and thereby committing a major crime while fasting, because committing physical intimacy with one's spouse while fasting requires a kafara. If that is the case, then it is haram, right? So again, to sum it up, it is permissible to kiss one's spouse while fasting, but it is considered disliked. And if there's a risk that it may lead to physical intimacy beyond that, then it is considered then it is considered haram because of the serious nature of engaging in physical intimacy while fasting. I hope that was clear and that was of benefit. This was my first session for this particular Q&A program that we'll be running. And I pray that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts it from us all. We've answered a number of questions. I have to do a count of how many we've actually been through. And we've noted the questions that have come through on the stream as well. And I say Jazakumullah khairan to you for joining us and for asking those questions. We'll add it to our list bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And if Allah permits, we plan on doing this on a regular basis. So same time next week, we'll be engaged again. So do share the word with others who may find this beneficial. But until then, وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد سبحان الله وبحمده سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى